There are a bunch of things we do without thinking. We just kind of do them naturally. Do you remember learning to drive a car? At the beginning, all of those things that you had to do and think about as you did them. Every time you moved your foot from the gas to the brake, you had to think about it. And you come up to an intersection, oh, wait a minute, I got to turn on the turn signal. And you had to think about where the turn signal was. And now you just get in and you do it naturally. You don't even think about it. Maybe if you get in a new car, an unfamiliar car, you think about it. Speaking, we don't think about speaking when we speak. For example, I want you to, I'll say a phrase. I want you to kind of say it to yourself, but out loud. I mean, softly, but out loud. And I want you to think about what your tongue is doing as you say it. You ready? Say, the cat ran after the dog. The cat ran after the dog. Think about how much your tongue did while you said that. Say it again and pay attention to your tongue. The cat ran after the dog. See, your tongue is just doing amazing things. They say that learning to read is nothing. For little kids, you know, learning to read is nothing compared to learning to speak. It's an amazing thing that the brain does, all the coordination, but we don't even think about it. We just do it. I just finished reading a very good book by Mort Kondracki. I don't know if you know who he is. He edits a weekly magazine, news magazine. You see him on TV. Sometimes he's a political analyst. But he wrote a book called Saving Millie about his wife who has Parkinson's disease and is in probably end stages of Parkinson's disease. And Saving Millie is the story of their relationship and her getting Parkinson's disease and his caring for her and what's going on with the cure for Parkinson's, that kind of thing. I read the book, and when I was, and I just read it, and I didn't think about necessarily what I was doing when I read it. I just read it and enjoyed the book and learned a lot. Learned a lot about Mort Kondracki, whom I knew from seeing on TV, and I learned about Millie, who I'd never heard of before, and I learned about Parkinson's and politics and all kinds of things. I never thought about the process my brain was using when I read that book. I just assumed it was a piece of nonfiction, that there really is a guy named Mort Kondracki. I assumed that he really has a wife named Millie, and she really has a disease called Parkinson's, and that the symptoms that he talks about that she has are the real symptoms of Parkinson's. Didn't give it a thought. You do the same thing. If you were to read Saving Millie, you'd do it just like that. When you read the newspaper, you're doing the same thing. If you pick up a book of poetry, do you read poetry? I'm not a big poetry fan. I'm one of those old-fashioned guys that thinks poetry should rhyme every so often, and yeah. But when you read poetry, if you read poetry, there's a word for that. It's called hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is too big a word that has nothing to do with any other word I know of. It means the science of the interpretation of literature. When I read Saving Millie, I was doing hermeneutics, but like driving a car or saying the cat ran after the dog, I wasn't thinking about what I was doing when I did hermeneutics. I assume there's a guy named Mort Kondracki, that he has a wife named Millie, and that she has Parkinson's. But maybe not at all. I mean, maybe there is no Mort Kondracki. Maybe Mort Kondracki is a metaphor for the establishment, the social establishment. And maybe he doesn't have a wife named Millie because he doesn't exist. Maybe Millie is a metaphor for the disadvantaged and disenfranchised. And there's no Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's he used as a metaphor. You see what I mean? When you pick up something and read it, you're doing hermeneutics, whether you're thinking about it or not. Most people have never heard of the word hermeneutics, but they do it all the time. Do you remember high school English class when you had to read a story or read a poem and the teacher said, "Now, what does that mean?" I once got in real trouble in English class because Mrs. Malley asked the question, What did Poe mean when he wrote that story? And I raised my hand and I said, maybe he just meant he had the rent to pay and he needed to sell something, and that did not go over well with Mrs. She wanted to do hermeneutics. Now, she didn't use that word. Hermeneutics is the science of the interpretation of literature. We do it all the time, whether we realize it or not. Okay, now, when we come to the Bible, we're also doing hermeneutics. Turn in your Bibles to the Gospels, just anywhere in the Gospels. Doesn't make any difference where. The Gospels record the life and ministry of Jesus Christ on earth. And so if you look at the Gospels and you were to start reading someplace in there, you'd read about maybe he was at the Sea of Galilee and spending time with the fishermen. That Christ was having a conversation with Peter. Was he? Was there really a person named Jesus Christ? Was there really a person named Peter? And did they really say these things to each other? Or is this like some poetry? And you know, there really never was Ahab, and there never was a Moby Dick, and there never was Queequeg, and he made all of those up. And did you know that Moby Dick is not just a story, it's a metaphor? And Mrs. Malley was right. All of those things do in fact mean something, not literally, but allegorically, metaphorically, figuratively. And so, when you read in the Gospels, you're assuming that there was a person named Jesus Christ, there was a guy named Peter, and they had this conversation, and he really did these things, he really calmed the sea, and he really healed that leper. You're doing hermeneutics. And when you read in the Old Testament about a nation called Israel of 2 to 3 million people that lived in a place called the Promised Land, did they really? Or is that a metaphor? Is the Promised Land a figure of speech for heaven? And that was their goal, metaphorically speaking, because that's our goal. And so one of the issues when we read the Bible is determining whether we're going to understand it literally or figuratively, metaphorically. And that whole issue is called hermeneutics. Now, Mrs. Malley was right. Poe, Melville, Robert Frost had something they were trying to communicate using words in an allegorical sense. She was right. Didn't like it, but she was right. And when she asked the question, what did Poe mean? She was asking the right question. Mrs. Malley didn't ask, what do you get out of this? What do you think? How do you feel about this? The question is, what did Poe mean? He wrote it, and what he meant is determinative. If he meant me to understand it literally, then I should. If he meant it to be understood allegorically, then it should be. And the allegory that he intended is the allegory I should try to get. And so, one of the girls over there raises her hand and she says, I think Poe meant, and she gives an explanation, and she says, that's very interesting, Sally. What does somebody else think? And Bill, and don't you hate guys that are good at poetry? Bill raises his hand and says, I think Poe meant, and he gives a different interpretation of Poe's metaphor. Are they both right? They can't both be right. If it's allegorical, if it's metaphor, there's still only one right answer, and the right answer is what Poe intended. And we can study the literature, and we can read this poem over and over again and discuss it, and hopefully as we do that, we'll come to some consensus about what Poe meant. If Poe were to come back from the grave and say, you idiots, you've missed the whole thing, we'd have to agree with him, because it's the author's intent. And if Poe said, no, seriously, folks, there really was a guy that killed his wife and bricked her up in the wall. Remember that Poe poem? Yeah. that really happened. It happened down the street from me, and it was in all the newspapers. Then we'd have to say, then if Poe intended us to understand this literally, and so when we come to read the Bible, the question is not, what do I think this means? And what do you think it means? The question has to be, what did God intend? It's the author's decision. What he decides, that's what we have to discover. And so, when we go to the Bible and we have to do the business of hermeneutics, we have to ask the question, does God intend for us to understand this literally or allegorically? Are things like the promised land and Israel and the covenant of circumcision and all of those, and the dietary rules and regs, and are all those intended to be understood and interpreted literally or allegorically? That's hermeneutics. Now, there are, in fact, two schools of thought on that. Most evangelical scholars of the Bible are in total agreement that the Gospels, for example, should be understood literally. There's no question about that. Most evangelical scholars are in absolute agreement that there was a nation Israel that was in Egypt, that went through the Exodus, and went to Sinai and then went into the Promised Land. That's not at issue. That's not a problem. There are other passages, however, where there's honest disagreement between evangelical, believing Christians about what God intended. And it has to do largely with prophetic sections. For example, God had the nation Israel, and He said to them, "You are my special people, and these are some of the things I'm going to do for you." And we'll look in later sessions at some of these things. And He told them some of the specific promises He was going to make to them and how they would be fulfilled. Did He mean those promises literally? When God said, I'm going to put you in the promised land, and you will be the number one nation on earth, and all of the other nations will be under your rule. You'll be preeminent on the earth, and I will come down, and I will rule in your midst over all of the earth in a great kingdom that will last for 1,000 years in Jerusalem. Did the author intend that to be understood literally or allegorically? Those kinds of things are where the rub comes. When he says, in that kingdom, the lion will lie down with the lamb and eat straw like the ox, is that literal or is that an allegory? A number of years ago, I don't know how many, but Charles Ryrie, who was a professor at Dallas Theological Seminary, wrote a book in which he gives 3 reasons why he believes the Bible should be understood literally, that a literal hermeneutic, as opposed to an allegorical, a literal hermeneutic should be consistently applied. His first reason he calls the philosophical reason. By that he means the purpose of language. We don't think about language, but Ryrie's point is God invented language. He's the one that came up. When He created Adam and Eve, was there an Adam and Eve? You see, you're doing hermeneutics. Was there a little, well, he believes there was. All right, when God created Adam and Eve, He's the one that gave them the ability to speak to each other, to communicate using language. Ryrie says, why did He do that? So that husband and wife could talk to each other? Well, sure, but not primarily. He did that primarily because He wanted to communicate with man. That's more important, that He wanted to communicate with Adam and Eve. And so He gave them the ability to speak. He invented language and designed it and gave it to them. Now, right now I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Chicago is about 2.5 hours away. Let's say I want to go to Chicago. And I get up one morning and I think, it's really too far to walk. I think I want to design a vehicle that will get me from Grand Rapids to Chicago. And so I go out in my shop and I build a basic box, let's say, out of 2x4s, and I put 4 wheels on it. two in the front and two in back, and I make the front two so that they turn, okay? And then I get an engine, and I put an engine in this thing because I want this thing to carry me there because I don't want to walk. So I put an engine in it, and I hook the engine up to the back two wheels, and then I put a seat and a stereo in it. Now I'm ready to go to Chicago. So I get this thing out of the garage, and I start up the engine, and I go to the back, and I start pushing. And before very long, I've come to the end of my driveway, and I need to make a left turn. And so I run up in front, and hard as I can, I take those two wheels, and I bend them to the left, and then I go in back, and I push. And when I'm around the corner, I go up in front and straighten those wheels out, and I push. All the time, the engine is running, and the stereo's on, and the seat is there, and it's padded, and I push this thing all the way to Chicago. Well, that would be ridiculous, wouldn't it? Why would I design something that would do the job and then not use it the way it was designed? Which would you say is the normal way to use language? Literal or figurative and allegorical? Literal. When we say things, we normally understand. And so, what Ryrie means when he says the philosophical argument is that God designed language. He designed it adequate to the task He intended, communicating with man and man communicating with each other in its normal way. He didn't design it to be used in some trick way. He just made it adequate for the task, and that's the normal way to use it. And so Ryrie says, instead of coming up with some really trick and difficult way, wouldn't God, if His goal was to communicate with us in His Word, wouldn't He do that, philosophically speaking, wouldn't He just do that in the normal way? And the literal hermeneutic is what's normal. His second reason, he calls the biblical reason. And by that he means, let's look at the Old Testament and let's go through and find all of the prophecies, the predictions about Christ's coming to earth. The first advent, when He was born in a manger and grew up in Galilee and spent 3 years preaching and teaching, died on the cross, was buried, and rose again the third day, and then eventually ascended into heaven. He says, let's take all of the Old Testament prophecies that predict those events. And as it turns out, there's about 200 of them. Now, he says, let's take a look and see whether those were fulfilled literally or allegorically. And if you go down the line, and let's say that there were 200 even, if you went down the line, for example, in the book of Micah, chapter 5, Micah says, O Bethlehem of Ephratah, though you are least among all the cities of Judah, out of you will come the Redeemer. Now let's take that. Now he says, was Christ born in Bethlehem? What's the answer? Yes. Yeah. He says, every one of those 200, when you list them, was fulfilled literally or allegorically? Literally. Yeah. He wasn't born in some small village someplace, metaphor, allegory. He was born specifically in Bethlehem in Judah. So when he says the other reason for interpreting it literally is biblical, he means all of the prophecies that have been fulfilled literally. Therefore, it's reasonable to assume all other prophecies will be fulfilled the same way. His third reason for interpreting the Bible literally, for using a literal hermeneutic, is logical. You remember we had, was it Sally or Susie that did Poe's poem and said, okay, all right. And Bill over here thought it meant something else. Which one of them is right? I mean, Poe's dead. We can't bring him back and ask him. Which one of them is right? Mrs. Malley, the English teacher, has her view on which one is right. But wait a minute. Just because she has blue hair doesn't mean that she's got some insight on the truth beyond Sally and Bill. Here are 3 different views. Which one of them is right? There's no way of knowing, absent Poe returning from the grave. And so when he says the third reason for using a literal hermeneutic is the logical reason, what he means is is if we use an allegorical hermeneutic, there's no objectivity. If you read a verse back here and you say, I believe this verse teaches us that God is going to do such and such in my life and in your life and in the lives of all who trust Him, it doesn't really mean this, it means that. And somebody over here says, no, it doesn't mean that at all. What it really means is that in the world, God is... Which one of them is right? There's suddenly no objectivity. If it doesn't mean what it says, what does it mean? And absent the author coming back and says, you're all idiots, it means this. If God doesn't do that, we've lost all objectivity and have no idea. And so, Ryrie says, we're going to adopt a literal hermeneutic. We're going to assume that this means what it says and says what it means, and we're just going to read it and take it at face value. Just like I read Mort Kondracki's book and understood it to mean what it says, I'm going to read the Bible and mean what it says. We'll use a literal hermeneutic for his three reasons. Now, there's one other thing we should say about the literal hermeneutic. Make sure we're all on the same page. There's one more thing we should say about the literal hermeneutic to make sure we're all on the same page. What is that? To make sure we're all on the same page. What is that? It is a figure of speech. We have figures of speech in language, don't we? My name is Craig McDonald. Is it really? Or is Craig McDonald an allegory for... You're understanding me literally, aren't you? We've been talking like this for a few minutes here now, and you're understanding me literally. And yet I said, let's make sure we're all on the same page. Are you sitting on a page? You're not. And we're not all sitting on the same page. Figures of speech, when interpreted literally, most of them would be pretty silly. And on the same page is one of them. Our language is full of figures of speech. All language is full of figures of speech. Whether you're in America, whether you're in Africa someplace, South America, wherever you are, all languages have figures of speech. How did you know I wasn't speaking literally when I said, let's make sure we're all on the same page? How come you knew not to understand that literally? If I went to Africa, if I went into the middle of Tanzania and said in Swahili to the Africans, and I can't do this, so I won't fake it. If I said, let's make sure we're all on the same page, what would the Africans do? What in the world is that guy talking about? The reason that you understood it as a figure of speech is because it's common in our language. We have certain figures of speech that we use all the time. I'm so hungry I could eat a cow or eat a horse. Yeah, we don't mean that literally, but there may be places in the world where if you said that, yeah, that's bad. What does that mean? That's bad. That may mean it's very good. Yeah, yeah. In 1940, in Chicago, if you said, that's bad, everybody understood it was bad. They took that literally. In 1985 Chicago, if you said, that's bad, that's cool. That's cool? No, it's not cool, and it's not hot. It's, you see? In other words, figures of speech are normal in language, depending on time and place. So I can say on the same page in America, and you understand it as a figure of speech because in America, place, it means something that we all understand is figurative. In Africa, different place, same time, different place, it wouldn't work. You can say that's bad in 1940, one time, and in 1985, a different, so it's both time and place. But figures of speech are part of language. There's a Latin phrase to describe that. It's usus loquendi, and it means use in location. And the location may be geography, or the location may be in time, but when something is used usus loquendi, in its appropriate time and place, if it's a figure of speech, it's understood as a figure of speech. So, are there figures of speech in the Bible? Sure there are. When we're reading, if we decide to use a literal hermeneutic, should we understand every single word and phrase literally? No, because there will be figures of speech in there. How will we know what's a figure of speech and what isn't? What we're going to have to do is determine its usus loquendi. We're going to have to become familiar enough with, in the case of the Old Testament, Jewish culture, 2,000 years before Christ, to know, oh, wait a minute, when you said, like a dove, they understood that as a figure of speech, okay? We're going to have to know their time and place well enough. Now, that might be a little frightening, except for the fact that we have so much literature from biblical times and biblical places that it's really 99 times out of 100 it's a no-brainer. We know what the figures of speech were that were standard in their vocabulary and in their literature back then. And so we really don't have to worry about that. And we will read, as we read the Bible, we'll come across figures of speech, and because we live in a different time and in a different place, it may be necessary for a pastor or a Bible teacher to say, now, this was a figure of speech to them and it meant this. But usually, even you'll figure it out, you know? I mean, they're pretty obviously figures of speech. So, sometimes the literal hermeneutic, that phrase literal hermeneutic, is also called the normal hermeneutic. Because literal could give the impression that there are never figures of speech, and there are. So we use the word normal, which means normally we understand it literally, unless usus loquendi, use in location, we would normally take it as a figure of speech. So we call it the normal interpretation. Now, as we wrap this up here, we understand that we're going to use a literal or normal hermeneutic when we read the Bible. We're going to take it at face value. It means what it says and says what it means, unless it's clearly a figure of speech that was common in that time and place. The most significant outcome of using this literal hermeneutic is something that I think most Christians sort of take for granted as they read their Bible, but we probably shouldn't take it for granted. The most significant outcome is that there was a time when God was dealing with the nation Israel. Literal, okay? There was a nation Israel. They were the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He was dealing with Israel as his special people. That's what he says. We'll look at some of those passages. He promised them a land. He put them on that land, and he made many promises to them about what he was going to do in the future. There is also the body of Christ. The body of Christ is different from Israel. It's made up of Christians, individuals who have placed their faith in Jesus Christ, and it is irrelevant whether they're Jewish or Gentile, whether they're German or Swedish or African or Hispanic. It makes no... You see, back in the Bible when he said only with Israel, and anybody else that wants my blessing has to become a Jew. And now he says it doesn't make any difference. Jew or Gentile, male or female, slave or free. If we understand the Bible literally, we understand God has had two different programs running. And we don't come over here and try to make Jew a metaphor for, Jewish, descendant of Abraham, that's all. It means what it says. And over here, Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female, doesn't make any difference. So when you use a literal hermeneutic, you will come quickly to see that God has had two programs, a program for Israel in which they were his special people, and a program for all who believe in Jesus Christ as their personal Savior. So, next time you get in your car and drive, you won't be thinking about it. Next time you speak, you'll use your tongue and you won't be thinking about it. Next time you read your Bible, understand You're doing hermeneutics, whether you're thinking about it or not. And thinking about it is going to be important when it comes time to figure out what God is telling us.